When a state disappears, it does not announce itself. There is no single moment of failure, no formal declaration, no ceremony marking the end of order. The institutions simply stop performing their functions, quietly, incrementally, and in many cases, without any immediate visible consequence. Between December 1991 and roughly 1994, Russia lost its center in practical terms. Security fractured, economic planning collapsed, the currency lost most of its value in under 2 years. Legal enforcement became, in many regions, entirely theoretical. The question that followed was not whether something would fill that vacuum. Something always does. The question was what form it would take. At the time, it appeared temporary. To understand what happened in Russia in the 1990s, it is necessary to first understand what the Soviet state had actually been. The Soviet system was not merely a government. It was an integrated architecture of control that reached into nearly every dimension of daily life. The state assigned housing. The state determined employment. The state controlled prices, distribution networks, travel, publishing, and communication. It was not one institution among many. It was the connective tissue of the entire social structure. When that structure dissolved, it did not leave behind a functioning market economy waiting to be liberated. It left behind an almost total absence of the institutional infrastructure that markets require to function: property rights, contract enforcement, independent courts, a regulatory framework, a reliable banking system. None of those things existed in any meaningful form in December 1991. What did exist was a population of approximately 148 million people who needed to eat, work, and conduct economic life, and a collection of individuals, some of them former state officials, some of them criminal entrepreneurs, some of them simply opportunists who understood that need, and understood the profit available in meeting it. Consider a small restaurant owner in Moscow in early 1992, a composite, consistent with accounts from the period. She had survived the Soviet period. She understood bureaucracy, shortage, and the informal arrangements that kept any business functioning under a planned economy. What she had not prepared for was the complete disappearance of predictable rules. Her suppliers demanded cash, not vouchers. Her landlord renegotiated terms every few weeks, and almost immediately, men appeared at her door. Not police, not inspectors. Men who explained, without particular hostility, that a neighborhood required organization, that unprotected businesses invited problems, that a monthly arrangement would ensure she had none. She did not call the police. She called the roof, not because she admired them, not because she feared them especially, but because they answered the phone. This is where the story of Russian organized crime in the 1990s actually begins, not in a prison, not in a criminal meeting, in the gap between what a citizen needed and what the state could no longer provide. The economic shock of the early 1990s requires careful examination because its scale is difficult to convey in ordinary terms. In January 1992, the Russian government, under acting Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar, implemented what became known as shock therapy. Price controls were lifted on approximately 90% of consumer goods and 80% of industrial goods almost simultaneously. Within weeks, prices increased by an average of 250%. By the end of 1992, widely cited official statistics at the time reported annual inflation of approximately 2,500%. By the end of 1993, the cumulative price level was roughly 26 times what it had been before liberalization began. The practical consequence was immediate. Savings accumulated over decades were destroyed within months. A factory worker who had diligently saved the equivalent of several years' wages found those savings could no longer purchase a month's groceries. Pensioners relying on fixed state payments found them worth, in real terms, a small fraction of their previous value. At the same time, enterprises that employed most of the working population had lost their Soviet-era supply chains, their state-assigned customers, and their access to subsidized credit. Many stopped paying wages entirely. According to data compiled by the Russian Statistical Agency and later analyzed by academic economists, Wage arrears, unpaid salaries, owed to workers accumulated to approximately 50 trillion rubles in nominal terms by the mid-1990s, a figure often cited to show how widespread wage non-payment had become. Millions of workers continued reporting to jobs they were no longer being paid for. They did so because the social ties to their enterprise had not yet dissolved. Because there was nowhere else to go, the state itself could not pay its own employees reliably. Police officers, prosecutors, tax inspectors, and customs officials went for months without regular salaries. This is not a peripheral detail. It is a structural condition. When the enforcement apparatus of the state cannot pay its own personnel, the enforcement apparatus of the state becomes available for purchase. No one described it as structural. At the time, it was described as a difficult transition, a painful but necessary adjustment, a temporary period of hardship on the road to a functioning market economy. The pattern would only become visible later. Into this environment entered the organized criminal networks. They did not emerge from nowhere. They had roots, deep ones, in the Soviet prison system and in the underground economic structures that had existed beneath the surface of the planned economy for decades. The Soviet economy had always had an informal layer because the planned economy chronically failed to produce sufficient consumer goods. A shadow economy had developed, networks of individuals who could obtain scarce goods, who could move resources between enterprises technically prohibited from trading directly, who could arrange transactions the official system was unable to facilitate. These networks required trust, enforcement, and distribution infrastructure. They required exactly the organizational capabilities that would later define criminal enterprise. The Soviet prison system had, over decades, produced its own distinct culture and hierarchy. Within the Gulag and its successor institutions, a class of professional criminals had developed an elaborate code of conduct, a system of status and obligation, and institutional structures for internal governance. The highest tier of this hierarchy was known as the Voryvy Zakon, a Russian phrase typically translated as thieves in law. The Vory were not simply violent criminals. They were, in a precise sociological sense, an alternative institution. They had their own laws, the Vorovskoy Zakon, or Thieves' Code, their own adjudicative procedures, their own mechanisms for contract enforcement, dispute resolution, and the punishment of defection. They operated by a strict prohibition on cooperation with state authority, a prohibition that, paradoxically, gave them a form of institutional credibility among populations who had learned to distrust the state. For decades, the Vory had been functional parasites on the Soviet system, a subculture that existed in tension with state authority but was ultimately contained by it. State power was strong enough, surveillance dense enough, and repression credible enough that the Vory's activities were largely confined to the prison environment and to specific criminal niches. When state authority collapsed, that containment disappeared. The skills developed inside the Gulag dispute resolution, loyalty enforcement, governance under conditions of official hostility were suddenly relevant outside of it, and the men who possessed those skills were positioned to use them. The early years of the Russian Federation, 1992, 1993, 1994, saw the rapid expansion of criminal protection networks into legitimate economic activity. The mechanism was straightforward: an enterprise, a shop, a market stall, a trading company. A restaurant required protection from theft, from rival criminal groups, from the various forms of coercion that had become routine in the absence of reliable legal enforcement. The state police could not reliably provide this, for reasons that were partly structural: insufficient resources, collapsed communications, poor equipment, and partly because officers not being paid reliably could not be relied upon. Criminal groups offered an alternative. In exchange for a regular payment, the krisha, meaning a roof, meaning protection, a criminal organization would provide security services. They would deter rivals. They would adjudicate disputes between businesses. They would enforce contracts that the legal system could not, or would not, enforce. For many businesses, this was not experienced primarily as extortion. It was experienced as a market for a necessary service. The protection was real. The enforcement was real. The alternative, attempting to operate without any protection in an environment of pervasive criminality, was not viable for most enterprises. The state offered legality without reliability. The roof offered reliability without legality. Sociologist Diego Gambetta, whose academic work on criminal protection markets is among the most rigorous available, has argued that the Sicilian Mafia should be understood not primarily as a criminal gang, but as an industry that produces, promotes, and sells private protection. The parallel to the Russian case of the early 1990s is not coincidental. The structural conditions are nearly identical: weak state enforcement, high demand for contract security, the presence of organized groups with the capacity to provide it. By 1993, according to estimates later cited by the Russian Interior Ministry and by journalists who covered the period, a substantial majority of Russian businesses in major urban centers were paying some form of krisha. The estimates varied widely. The Interior Ministry's figures suggested between 70% and 80% of businesses in Moscow. Critics of those estimates still agreed the phenomenon was pervasive. Criminal networks had become, in a functional sense, a parallel taxation system. They extracted revenue from economic activity. They provided, in return, a form of order. The roof was not protection from criminals. It was protection from the state's absence. At the time, it appeared temporary. The structure of these criminal networks in the early 1990s was not monolithic. This is an important point, often obscured by retrospective accounts that impose false coherence on a period of genuine organizational chaos. Different cities had different dominant groups. Different sectors attracted different criminal networks. The groups that controlled the markets of central Moscow were not the same groups that controlled the port infrastructure of St. Petersburg, or the metal trading networks of the Urals, or the oil logistics of Western Siberia. Some groups had roots in the vor culture of the Soviet prison system. Others were composed of former athletes, particularly wrestlers and boxers who had been trained by the Soviet state and then left without employment when the sports clubs lost their funding. In journalistic and academic accounts of the period, these groups are frequently referred to as sportsmen. They had physical capacity, organizational discipline, and no particular ideological commitment to the traditional codes of the vor hierarchy. They were entrepreneurs. The product they sold happened to be force. Others still were composed of former KGB or military personnel, individuals with professional training in surveillance, coercion, and organizational logistics, whose formal employment had been disrupted by the institutional reorganization that followed the Soviet collapse. These different formations competed with each other, sometimes violently. They also, in many cases, formed alliances of convenience, divided territories, and developed informal norms governing the boundaries of acceptable competition. The sociologist Vadim Volkov, in his study of violent entrepreneurs in post-Soviet Russia, describes this period as one of market entry, a phase in which many competing groups were establishing themselves in the protection market, testing the limits of their capacity, and beginning the process of territorial consolidation. Volkov's analysis, based on extensive fieldwork and court records, is among the most careful academic treatments of this period available. What Volkov describes is not chaos in the sense of random disorder. It is competition, brutal, violent, and lethal, but structurally comprehensible as competition. The violence had a market logic. The gang wars of the mid-1990s are often described in retrospective accounts as an outbreak of irrational violence. That framing is misleading. The violence was instrumentally rational in a specific sense. It was the mechanism by which competing organizations established market boundaries in the absence of any other mechanism for doing so. In a functional legal environment, market boundaries are established through contract, licensing, regulatory exclusion, and litigation. None of those mechanisms were available. What remained was physical capacity. The group that could credibly threaten greater harm than its competitors could establish its territorial claim. A killing was not a message to the public. It was a memo to the market. The contract killing, what Russian journalists began referring to as the zakaznoye ubийство, or commission murder became a standard tool of commercial competition. Rival criminal leaders were assassinated. Business owners who switched their krisha were punished. Bankers who failed to honor agreements were killed. According to records compiled by the Russian Interior Ministry and analyzed in subsequent academic and journalistic work, contract killings in Russia numbered in the hundreds annually by the mid-1990s. The data was incomplete and collection inconsistent. Figures cited in some parliamentary materials and press reporting suggested several hundred documented contract killings in 1994 alone, with other sources estimating higher. Many cases were never reported or were reported as accidents or suicides. Car bombings became a frequent method. The assassination of a criminal leader or a businessman in a contested sector would be followed by retaliation, then counter-retaliation. Particular cities Moscow, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg experienced periods of sustained intergroup violence that resembled, in their structural logic, the gang wars of American Prohibition-era cities. The parallel is not merely rhetorical. The economic historian Charles Kindleberger observed that Prohibition in the United States created conditions structurally analogous to what Russia experienced in the early 1990s. The sudden deinstitutionalization of a market created a vacuum that criminal entrepreneurs filled, competing violently until a degree of territorial consolidation was achieved. In both cases, the violence was not an end in itself. It was the cost of establishing a market structure in the absence of legal mechanisms for doing so. In a market economy, contracts create order. In this economy, bullets did. The pattern would only become visible later. By 1994 and 1995, the initial phase of violent competition was beginning to give way to something more structured. Consolidation is the correct word. The dozens of competing criminal groups that had operated in major Russian cities in 1992 and 1993 were being reduced through violence, absorption, and alliance into larger and more durable organizations. The survivors of the competitive phase were not necessarily the most violent. They were the organizations that had successfully developed what Volkov calls organizational capital, internal discipline, administrative capacity, financial infrastructure, political connections that allowed them to sustain operations across a range of environments. The groups that had relied purely on personal charisma or physical intimidation tended to be unstable, vulnerable to internal defection when leadership was removed, prone to fragmentation when the founding membership aged or was killed. The surviving organizations had developed reliable internal hierarchies. They had created mechanisms for distributing revenue, resolving internal disputes, and maintaining organizational loyalty. And they had done something more significant, something that fundamentally altered the nature of what they were. They had entered the formal economy. The criminal organizations of the mid-1990s were not operating parallel to the legitimate economy. They were operating through it. They had acquired, in many cases, through coercion, in others through investment, in still others through the direct exploitation of the privatization process, legitimate business interests, banks, trading companies, media properties, real estate, manufacturing enterprises. These holdings served multiple functions. They provided legal income that could be declared to tax authorities. They provided infrastructure for the movement and concealment of funds. And they provided institutional cover. An organization that controlled a bank or a trading company occupied a fundamentally different position in the social and political landscape than one that merely provided street-level protection services. Protection was the entry point. Ownership was the objective. Violence collected cash. Privatization turned cash into power. The privatization process of the early 1990s deserves particular attention. Between 1992 and 1994, the Russian government implemented a voucher privatization program, a system through which Soviet state assets were to be transferred to the general population in the form of privatization vouchers, which citizens could then use to purchase shares in former state enterprises. The program was designed, in theory, to create broad-based share ownership in a new market economy. In practice, as economists and investigators later documented in extensive detail, it functioned quite differently. The vouchers were issued to citizens who, in many cases had no understanding of how to value or use them, and who were simultaneously dealing with the immediate crisis of hyperinflation and wage arrears. They were frequently sold for cash at a fraction of their nominal value. They were accumulated by individuals and organizations with the financial resources and organizational capacity to move quickly, including criminal organizations that had, by 1992 and 1993, accumulated substantial cash holdings from their protection and trading activities. The result was the transfer of former state enterprises' factories, mines, ports, logistics networks into the hands of a small number of individuals and organizations. The process by which this occurred has been documented by journalists, including Paul Klebnikov, whose work on Russian business in the 1990s remains a foundational reference, and by academic economists, including Marshall Goldman, whose analysis of the privatization process drew on extensive primary sources. Klebnikov, it should be noted, was later assassinated in Moscow in 2004. His case was never prosecuted to a final conviction. The capture of state assets through privatization represented a qualitative shift in the nature of Russian organized crime. It was no longer simply a matter of extracting revenue from legitimate businesses through protection payments. Criminal organizations, or more precisely, the networks that emerged from the intersection of criminal capital, political connections, and the privatization process were becoming the owners of the productive infrastructure of the Russian economy. The distinction between criminal and legitimate enterprise was becoming increasingly theoretical. Privatization did not reduce criminal power, it gave it paperwork. The banking sector illustrates, in concentrated form, how institutional capture actually worked. Between 1988 and 1995, the number of licensed commercial banks in Russia grew from a handful of state institutions to approximately 2,500 independent entities. This expansion occurred in the context of a banking regulatory framework that was, by any measure, inadequate to the scale of the sector it was supposed to govern. The Central Bank of Russia lacked both the staffing and the institutional authority to conduct meaningful oversight of this number of institutions. The result was a banking environment that was, in practice, largely ungoverned. Criminal organizations recognized the utility of banking infrastructure almost immediately. A licensed commercial bank provided access to the interbank lending market, the ability to receive and transfer funds internationally, and a degree of legal protection against scrutiny of financial flows. Criminal networks, sometimes through direct ownership, sometimes through the placement of affiliated individuals in senior management, and sometimes through direct coercion of bank officials, gained significant influence over portions of the commercial banking sector. According to testimony presented to the Russian Parliamentary Commission examining organized crime in the mid-1990s, and analyses later published by investigators who worked on financial crime cases during this period, a significant number of Russian commercial banks during the early to mid-1990s were operating, in whole or in part, as instruments for the management of criminal proceeds. The specific figures cited in various official and journalistic sources differed. The documentary record remains contested and incomplete in this area, but the directional conclusion was consistent across multiple independent sources. The banking system had been substantially penetrated by criminal capital. The consequences were systemic. Capital extracted through protection payments, commodity trading, and asset privatization was being recycled through the banking system into further investment, further asset acquisition, and, increasingly, into international transfer. The movement of capital out of Russia, later documented extensively in investigations by European regulators, the U.S. Treasury Department, and investigative journalists, had begun in earnest by the mid-1990s. The pattern would only become visible later. Now consider a second figure, an investigator in Moscow in 1995. Accounts like this appear repeatedly in memoirs, journalistic interviews, and parliamentary testimony from the period composite in detail, but structurally consistent across the record. He had been assigned to an organized crime unit within the MVD. He was experienced. He was, by available accounts of how such units functioned, relatively honest. He was working a case involving a protection network that had moved into controlling a cluster of import businesses. He had testimony. He had financial documentation. He had built, over months, a record that should have supported prosecution. He had not been paid in 14 weeks. The electricity in his apartment had been disconnected. His supervisor had mentioned, more than once, that the case was generating complaints from sources he declined to name. A lawyer representing one of the targets had twice approached him, on each occasion with offers framed as career advice. He filed his reports. He pursued the case as far as he could. What happened to it after it left his hands is the kind of information that does not appear in official records. He was not corrupt. He was simply operating inside an institution that corruption had reached more deeply than he had. And he was discovering, at his level, what the criminal organizations had already understood at theirs. The law was not absent, it was selective. The law enforcement response to the developments of the early 1990s requires careful analysis, because it is not sufficient to describe it simply as failure. The Russian police, the Ministerstvo Vnutrenih Del, or MVD, was an institution designed for a specific purpose: the maintenance of social order in a society where acceptable behavior was defined by the Communist Party, and where the population was subject to dense surveillance and pervasive administrative control. It was not designed to investigate complex financial crime, to conduct long-term organized crime investigations, to prosecute cases requiring forensic accounting, electronic surveillance, and the management of protected witnesses. In the Soviet period, these deficiencies had not mattered greatly. The political authority of the state compensated for any investigative limitations. In the post-Soviet period, the police found themselves confronting precisely the kind of complex, financially sophisticated, politically connected criminal activity they were least equipped to address. There was also the question of resources. Officers at every level faced the same salary crisis that afflicted the rest of the state apparatus. In 1994 and 1995, investigators working organized crime cases in major Russian cities were often earning, in real terms, less than the businesses they were supposed to be protecting. The structural incentive to supplement official income through unofficial arrangements with the entities under investigation was, in many cases, overwhelming. Corruption within the law enforcement apparatus was not, during this period, a matter of isolated bad actors within a generally functional institution. It was, according to accounts compiled from court records, parliamentary investigations, and the testimony of officials who later cooperated with investigators, a pervasive structural condition. Officers at multiple levels of the hierarchy were engaged in arrangements ranging from passive acceptance of payments to active participation in criminal schemes that had become normalized within significant portions of the institution. This normalization is important. There is a qualitative difference between a corrupt institution that retains a general orientation toward its formal mandate and an institution in which corruption has become the default operational mode. By the mid-1990s, multiple independent accounts suggest that in at least some significant portions of the Russian law enforcement apparatus, the latter condition had been reached. The implications were structural. An institution corrupt at multiple levels and in pervasive ways cannot be reformed through the disciplining of individual officers. The corruption was not the cause of the institutional dysfunction. It was a symptom of conditions: inadequate pay, absent oversight, collapsed professional culture that produced corruption as a rational individual response. Individual officers were not failing the institution was failing them. The prosecution function faced its own distinct set of problems. Even in cases where police investigators had accumulated evidence sufficient to support prosecution, the path from investigation to conviction was far from reliable. Witnesses in organized crime cases faced credible threats of violence. The pattern of witness intimidation, ranging from direct threats to family members to assassination, was documented in numerous cases by journalists and by the small number of investigators who were able to work independently. The capacity to intimidate witnesses was itself a competitive advantage, and the larger and better-resourced criminal organizations invested in it systematically. Defense attorneys, operating in an environment where the boundary between legal representation and criminal facilitation had become blurred, were in some cases active participants in the corruption of the judicial process. Judges, facing the same economic pressures as other state employees and without the institutional insulation that an independent judiciary requires, were vulnerable to both financial inducement and direct threat. The acquittal rates in organized crime prosecutions during this period were, by international standards, extraordinarily high. Parliamentary inquiries and journalistic investigations documented numerous instances in which prosecutions with substantial evidentiary foundations collapsed at trial or were abandoned before reaching it. The result was a form of institutional paralysis. Not complete inaction cases were investigated, charges were filed, prosecutions occasionally succeeded, but the rate of successful prosecution was far below what would have been necessary to constitute a credible deterrent. The criminal organizations had learned, through direct experience, that the legal consequences of their activities were manageable. This learning had structural consequences. An organization that has accurately assessed that the probability of effective prosecution is low will invest differently than one that faces credible legal risk. It will be less cautious, more aggressive. It will expand more rapidly. The effective absence of legal deterrence was not simply a problem for law enforcement. It was a competitive advantage for criminal organizations. They understood it as such, and they used it. By 1995 and 1996, the landscape of Russian organized crime had been transformed in ways that were difficult to fully comprehend in real time. The explosive proliferation of independent criminal groups that had characterized the early transition period had given way to something more consolidated and, in certain respects, more stable. The most significant organizations had survived the violent competitive phase, had developed institutional depth, had established positions in the formal economy that gave them protection from both criminal rivals and state action. The protection racket, the krisha, the simple extraction of revenue from street-level businesses, remained a feature of the criminal landscape, but had been supplemented and, in many cases, superseded by more sophisticated forms of economic participation. Criminal organizations were not merely taxing the economy. In important sectors, metals trading, oil logistics, port operations, the banking system, real estate, they had become significant economic actors in their own right. Vadim Volkov describes this transition as the movement from violent entrepreneurship to organized crime in the institutional sense, a shift from organizations defined primarily by their capacity for violence to organizations for which violence was one tool among several, embedded in a broader institutional structure that included financial expertise, legal counsel, political relationships, and legitimate business holdings. The distinction is not merely academic. An organization that is primarily a violence delivery mechanism is vulnerable in specific ways to the elimination of its leadership through prosecution or rival violence, to the disruption of its territorial base, to the replacement of its services by a stronger competitor. An organization that has acquired institutional depth, that controls significant assets, that has developed expertise in financial management and legal navigation, that has established relationships with political actors at multiple levels, is a qualitatively different entity. By the mid-1990s, the most significant Russian criminal organizations had made this transition. They were not, in any simple sense, gangster organizations. They were hybrid entities, part criminal network, part financial institution, part political actor. Their activities spanned a range that no single institutional category adequately described. The international dimension of this development has been less systematically documented, but it was emerging clearly by the mid-1990s. The movement of capital out of Russia, through the banking system, through commodity trading accounts in offshore jurisdictions, through real estate acquisition in Western European cities and in the United States, was occurring at significant scale. Estimates of total capital outflow from Russia during the 1990s vary widely, and the methodology underlying different estimates is contested. Figures cited in various official and journalistic sources ranged from tens of billions to hundreds of billions of dollars over the course of the decade. No single figure can be confirmed with precision. What is better documented through the subsequent work of regulatory authorities in multiple jurisdictions is the mechanism. Russian capital, some of it legitimate, some of it of criminal origin, and much of it in a gray zone that defied clean categorization, was moving through a network of shell companies, correspondent banking relationships, and offshore financial centers. The Baltic states, particularly Latvia and Estonia, became significant transit points, as did Cyprus, Switzerland, and various Caribbean jurisdictions. Western European banks, operating in a regulatory environment that had not yet adapted to the scale or sophistications of the flows involved, processed transactions that would later draw regulatory scrutiny in retrospective reviews. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and Western governments that were providing financial assistance to Russia during this period were aware, at some level, that the economic environment they were attempting to support was experiencing significant capital flight and diversion at scale. The degree to which this awareness informed policy decisions during the period is a question that historians and economists continue to debate. Awareness did not automatically translate into effective leverage. What is clear is that the international financial infrastructure that allowed the proceeds of Russian criminal activity to be managed, invested, and protected was in place and functioning by the mid-1990s. The criminal organizations that had emerged from the institutional vacuum of 1991 were not merely domestic phenomena. They had acquired the organizational and financial sophistication to operate across multiple jurisdictions, to navigate varying regulatory frameworks, and to deploy their capital in ways that served their organizational interests. At the time, it appeared manageable. There is a question that becomes unavoidable at this point in the analysis: the violence, the corruption, the institutional paralysis, the capital flight. These were all visible, in some form, to anyone paying attention during the mid-1990s. Journalists documented them, parliamentary inquiries examined them, foreign governments raised them, academic researchers analyzed them, and yet the conditions that produced them did not improve in the ways that conventional analysis would have predicted. The strengthening of legal institutions that Western advisors prescribed as the solution to Russia's governance problems did not occur on the anticipated timeline. The criminal organizations that were supposed to be temporary features of a difficult transition did not dissolve as formal institutions strengthened. The reason, which became clear in retrospect, was that the analysis of the problem was incomplete. The conventional diagnosis in the mid-1990s was that Russia had weak institutions and that the solution was to build stronger ones. What this diagnosis missed was the degree to which the weakness of formal institutions was not simply a legacy of the Soviet period waiting to be overcome. In important respects, it was being actively maintained by interests that benefited from that weakness. This does not require a single coordinating center. It does not require explicit conspiracy. It can emerge, and in this case largely did emerge, from aligned incentives rather than coordinated design. An environment of institutional ambiguity where property rights were unclear, where legal enforcement was selective, where the rules governing economic activity were uncertain was not equally damaging to all actors. It was catastrophically damaging to the average citizen, the small business, the worker whose wages were unpaid. But it was structurally advantageous for the well-organized, well-financed, and politically connected actors who had learned to navigate ambiguity as a competitive environment. The hybrid criminal business political networks that had emerged from the chaos of the early transition period had a direct interest in the continued weakness of formal institutions. Strong courts, reliable property rights, and effective anti-corruption enforcement would constrain them in ways that weak institutions did not. The political and financial resources they had accumulated during the chaos of the early 1990s were, in part, being deployed to ensure that the institutional environment remained favorable to their continued operations. The weakness of the state was no longer simply a condition they were exploiting. It was becoming a product they were maintaining. The pattern would only become visible later. The year 1996 marks a useful, if imprecise, boundary in this analysis. It was the year of the Russian presidential election, an election whose conduct and outcome were themselves subjects of significant controversy, and whose connection to the financial networks that had emerged from the organized crime landscape of the early 1990s was documented by journalists and examined in subsequent academic work. The election campaign required resources at a scale that the formal mechanisms of Russian political finance could not have provided. The individuals and organizations that provided those resources, a group that journalists and later academics referred to by various terms, sometimes collectively described as the oligarchs, had accumulated their financial capacity through processes that were, in many cases, directly connected to the criminal and quasi-criminal structures of the preceding 5 years. This was not a simple relationship of criminal organizations purchasing political outcomes. It was something more structurally complex. The actors who had benefited most from the institutional vacuum of the early 1990s had accumulated the resources, the organizational capacity, and the political connections to participate directly in the governance of the state they had previously been parasitic upon. The chaos of 1991 to 1996, the hyperinflation, the wage arrears, the protection rackets, the gang wars, the institutional corruption, the criminal capture of state assets had not simply been endured by some actors while damaging others. It had been the competitive environment through which a specific set of actors accumulated the capital, the connections, and the power to move from operating outside state structures to operating through them. This was not, in retrospect, an accident. It was not simply a matter of certain individuals being smarter or more ruthless than others. It was the predictable outcome of a structural process. When the institutions that normally regulate access to economic and political power collapse, those willing and able to operate outside those institutions gain a structural advantage over those who are not. The question that follows who those actors were, how they consolidated their position, what form of governance they ultimately constructed from the wreckage of the Soviet state is not a question that can be answered within the boundaries of the 1991 to 1996 period. That answer belongs to the years that followed. By 1996, the most significant of these organizations had survived the violent competitive phase, had accumulated substantial economic holdings, had penetrated the banking system and the privatized industrial sector, had developed political connections at levels that gave them influence over the governance processes they had previously operated outside. The violence had established the territory. The privatization had established the ownership. The corruption had established the protection. Each phase had prepared the ground for the next. The chaos had served a purpose. What came next was not chaos. What came next was a question of who would organize the order, and on whose terms. That story begins where this one ends.